Hey, everybody. In today's episode, we're going to talk about what it's like to really lose a loved one. And particularly the reason why is because we all know what's happening in our country and, in fact, the whole world regarding COVID-19 and how there are so many people losing loved ones over the course of a couple of days, actually, to a couple of weeks. And in today's episode on the Introspection Hour, Patrick is going to be sharing some of the things that he had to deal with in terms of how he ended up losing his father, some of the emotions that he went through, some of the challenges that he had to overcome, and ultimately, how did he get through all of this? And so, Patrick, I appreciate you sharing this. I know we were just actually talking about this not too long ago, that you've never actually really opened up about talking about the loss of your father. Like, what was it like? Actually, first, can you share a little bit about what went on?
It happened about 3.5 years ago. And I remember because, my dad passed away at the same year as my daughter Ella was born. And so the timing is more than a coincidence, I think. It was kind of like this passing on a little bit. Sometimes I think my daughter channels my dad in different ways, but that's really where there's a connection. And what happened was my dad, he was progressing with just old age, and his body was starting to shut down. Lived a pretty good life of smoking and drinking and enjoying life in different ways. But towards the end, he started needing blood transfusions because his body wasn't producing white blood cells, and not at like, it might have been leukemia, it might not have been, but the blood transfusions helped for a little while. They got him going, they were good, but it wasn't sustainable. So
can I ask you something actually? Knowing that your father required all of these transfusions, normally I believe people are given a choice, right? Do you want to continue to do this? Like, how often actually was he required to get these treatments?
So it was once every couple of weeks in the beginning, and then it started to become more frequent. So you can tell when the transfusion effects wore off, and the period between transfusions was getting shorter.
Okay.
So what that meant, though, Brian, was that we had to really prepare. I mean, that was kind of like our first moment of, we're gonna have to prepare ourselves. Our dad has a pretty good chance of not sticking around for a long time. Like, this wasn't a permanent solution. It's crazy because in one way, my dad was somehow prepared for death before everyone else in the family. So I wanted to share kind of the way that he handled it, which was really interesting. He talked it over with my mom. He thought about it a lot himself, and he talked it over, and they kind of agreed when they got towards how many more transfusions, right? Because these transfusions, people might think, whatever you think about it, it's hard on the person, and it's long. It takes a whole day, and then if you're only getting a week or two out of it to keep going in your life, what kind of quality of life is that, right? Like, you're relying on something to give you 2 weeks worth of energy, and then you're back into this kind of like helpless and ailing state. So he had made a decision, but when he did something, when he went to his doctor's office and he asked his doctor if there was anything else he could do. And I think he didn't qualify for a lot of things because, like, his lungs weren't that great from smoking. His liver wasn't that great from drinking. His body was pretty much towards his end. And my dad, he thanked the doctor after the doctor said, "I can't do anything else for you." Right? Like, and what my dad thanked him for was to be honest and to just be truthful and to not sugarcoat it. Right? My dad just needed that. Like, sometimes the people who are close to or are terminally ill, they just need people to be straight with them so that they can understand what are the facts to make a decision. But he got one last transfusion, and that ended up lasting him about 2 weeks. And it was crazy. So they they let me know. My parents and my mom, my dad, my sister were in LA, in Southern California, and I was in DC. My wife was pregnant, so I knew I had to be there. I knew I had to be in DC, and it was Lena's first pregnancy, so we were just. It was crazy. It was like too many things going on at once. So in my mind there was a lot of compartmentalization, right? I compartmentalized everything. I went out to meet him for the very last time in my life.
Can I ask you something actually? Sorry to interrupt you. Like when your family actually talked about this, like your dad was sharing this with your mom, your sister, what were the sudden feelings that you had when you realized this is my dad's decision and this is the fact that he's getting his last transfusion means he's not, I don't want to use the word giving up, but he's made the decision that, you know what, I'm ready to die in a month or in 2 weeks. Like, how does that prepare someone knowing that the person that essentially your dad you grew up with, who was a father figure for you, is not going to be here in a month? Like, how does someone even prepare for that?
I don't know if there is preparation. I think it's all, what do you do and what's in your life when you hear the news? Right? When someone says it to you, especially someone like, your father that's been in your life or anyone that's been in your life, it made me like kind of check myself, right? So a lot of people might be like, no, he's not going to do it. He's going to go on. Like, it's not my decision. And who am I to force my dad into something? Right? Take away his choice, his free will to make decisions for what he thinks is best. Because he knew I had a daughter coming, but it would be another year and a half before he can see her, because traveling on an airplane, right? Like it, and then every 2 weeks going for a transfusion, and the transfusions get harder and harder just to hold down and then we're worrying about him. So like he took all this into account. But in my mind, it was like, all I could think about was he's not going to see my daughter. Right. And that was like the only thing going through my mind. And I don't know if it was any emotions I can figure out right now in terms of words. Right. But that was like the only thought, the biggest thought. And there was so much I wanted to still share with him in my life, right? Like I felt like I was just getting started in my life, as weird as that sounds. 30 some odd years old, right? Like I was just getting started, first kid, married and all that. So there was a lot of regret for things that didn't happen. Brian, how do you explain that? Like regret for things that didn't happen fast enough?
It's more almost like you want all of these things to occur, like for example, the birth of your daughter, in hopes that your dad could be there to see that, to experience that, to be a grandfather, right? So you kind of feel like you should have done it 5 years ago or 10 years ago when you were still young, while he was still around. And I get what you're saying.
Yeah. So it was a lot of that. That's what it was in my head. That's what was in my heart, and ultimately it was his decision, and I respected that. And because on the flip side, it's hard for me to even ask my dad to like, hey, can you hold out for another 2 years or a year and a half or a year or something? Just one. Like, I think he was comfortable with the fact that he knew I was gonna have a daughter, and I see his decision as a sacrifice for our family to be better. Instead of worrying about my dad, caring for him left and right, and then celebrating and trying to celebrate, the birth of my daughter, he kind of said, that's too much for my family. I don't need to have them suffer that much. I don't want them suffering for me that much. So a lot of his decision, it felt like he made it for our family. And this will sound a little bit different. Like he's made a lot of decisions which I thought were very selfish in life growing up. But this one, at the end, the very last, like one of the last decisions he made felt like a decision of sacrifice for the betterment of our family. Like he gave up being able to see my daughter with his own eyes, to see me and my wife and all that. So there's a lot of respect that I think just built up for my dad at that when I had that realization. And in fairness, that realization came like, I don't know, maybe a year afterwards, right? Back then all I thought about was like, he's gonna be gone. Do I go and stay with him? The logistics was going through my mind like crazy, right? I'm in DC, he's in Southern California. How long do I go there? What if something happens while I'm away and Lena has to go to the hospital? Like, who's going to take care of her? So many things going through my mind, right? I think Lena was second trimester at that point. So I think that's why I mentioned earlier, compartmentalization. I had to just to get through day to day and to make sure I don't miss anything. The responsibility of being a husband and a father, right? And so my parents, they totally understood it. They said, Patrick, make a quick trip here. My dad told me, don't stay for the 2 weeks. We'll call you when it's towards the end. So I made 2 trips within 2 weeks. One to see him when he was kind of right out of the hospital and after his transfusion, and then another at the very, very end. So those were very, and this is all happening in like the span of 1 or 2 months. So it's very sudden. It's very quick in terms of a life perspective.
So Patrick, I know you were talking about how you were just flying in and out, and basically your father asked you to come back kind of on the last day in the last week that he was about to pass. Can you kind of describe what the last moment was until your dad basically said his final, I guess, goodbye? Like how did that feel? Like what was that experience like?
I had a final goodbye moment, and then I had the final death moment. So the final goodbye moment was after he received his last transfusion. And I get there, and this is like a tidal wave. Like even on the plane flight, emotions. I was holding myself in as much as I could from breaking down on the plane, right? Like I was just like, I think there were like 3 or 4 times I was about to bawl, like just straight up in the middle of an air flight, and try to go to sleep, and TV wasn't helping. But I was in a pretty emotional state, and I get there, and my dad, he seemed happy. And in the last 2 weeks of his life, my mom and my sister described it as he was his true self, without any guilt, without any regret. Like all his burdens were lifted, so then he could actually show who he truly was, which is someone that we had seen but got layered, with the negatives, right? So in his core, we knew he was a really good person at heart, but then throughout life, like it layered and layered and layered, and that actually ended up being like the best 2 weeks of my dad with my mom and my sister. But I get there. And the significance of this is there wasn't much that my dad and I said. Like we hugged. It's very somber. The last 3 things he said to me just kind of set me up to deal with his death and his passing so well, right? The first thing he said was, "I'm proud of you." And let's use this as a moment of stereotypical comical relief. If you're an Asian kid, you kind of understand what that means. Like for your dad to say he's proud of you, it's a big accomplishment. Like Asian parents and fathers in general usually don't say
B+.
that.
Come on, man. What the heck?
Yeah. Right. And so so I'm like, wow, finally heard it genuinely. Right. I kind of sensed it before. The second thing he said, of course, was to, take care of my mom and my sister. I was the man of the house, kind of that mentality, but just always stay true to the family. And the third thing surprised me. And it took me the better part of even the last 3 years to really internalize it, which he said it in Korean. He said, 모르는 사람들 도와주라. And what that translates to is help people you don't know. To this day, I have no reason, I'm still understanding why he would tell me that as one of the last things in life, right? And literally it was the last thing he said to me. Because afterwards it was just like, bye. And then like, I mean, you know, I stayed the night and I mean, I ran into the bathroom and that thing was like pure Niagara waterfalls right there. But I'm still internalizing it. Help people I don't know. But that phrase has given me that hope throughout this whole time that's carried me so much, right? Like, because there's family members that have passed that you're like, what was the meaning of that? What was the meaning of them in our lives? And for my dad to have some sort of clarity, to be able to give me a mission in life. And that's really what I think he did. We go through life and we're like, what is my purpose? What is my mission? And I feel like he just gave it to me as his last thing. And I'm accepting of it, right? So that kind of was the last moments with my dad. And it was pretty significant.
It's funny that you bring this up because, for example, a lot of times when they say in order to essentially be happy, a lot of times it's not so much doing things for yourself, but it's doing things for other people, right? And I know this is a little bit of tangential topic, but I remember when I had my freak out moment, when I had my panic attack, Pat, I was in my hallway and I was talking to the paramedics. And one of the things that was going on in my head was I a good person? Because I had that feeling like I was going to die. I mean, as crazy as that sounds, but I think that's what goes on through a lot of people's heads is like they feel like, were they a good person, right? And hopefully they were, so that they could spread that generosity towards other people, you know? And that's what we essentially, I think, comes down to, like, were we a good person? And can we essentially, how can we use our last remaining moments here in life to help those around us?
And it also, like, it spoke to his true self, which is something that, like, I got, my mom and my sister mostly got to see the very end of my father's life. Before, the negatives are what people saw, right? Like, but if you ever were around my dad, you kind of had this experience, Brian. Whenever you came over and you said you had a problem or you didn't know what was wrong with your car, like, my dad was the type of person, if you came to our house and you said you had a problem, he would try to help you as best as he could. He would fix whatever he could, right? He was good with his hands. And that true self came out the last 2 weeks. And I think from that true self was why he was able to give me that mission in life. And then, you know, so I go back to DC and then within about 2 weeks, you know, kind of, I get the call and I got to go back and I'm still, you know, crazy crying. And, you know, we did a couple of video calls with Lena so that Lena could say goodbye. Because that was hard too. He had just met Lena. He really liked Lena. He really, really liked Lena, like to the point where I was like, okay, borderline jealousy, right? Like, I think he liked her more than me and my sister in a way. But then they only got to say goodbye through video, and luckily they had video. But that mission is like an advice to people. If for whatever reason you're listening to this and you know you're gonna die or you're gonna pass this life, and you can somehow know it in yourself to give a mission to the next generations, to the people, to like one or two people, right? You can't be like giving a mission to everyone, but it's like there's one or two people who are you really, really care about in this life, and you give them a mission that will hold them through the grief, that will hold them through the pain. I gotta say, that's like the only thing keeping me going sometimes on this, you know, when thinking about my dad.
So, you know, I know that not too long after that last final goodbye, like you started going through, I guess, the funeral process and all that. And I remember actually when you sent the message out to our group chat, you said, hey, you know, my dad passed away. And I'm sorry to say, like, I couldn't be there for you, man. Like, I know when you had your funeral, is it procession or just the event itself? Like, I wasn't able to be there, and I'm sorry. Like, I wanted to be there, you know? Can you kind of describe, like, you know, are you familiar with the five stages of grief? Kubler-Ross's five stages of grief?
Vaguely, but you should remind us.
So, for those of you who don't remember or recall the five stages of grief, people will generally go through, in no specific order, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. Like, did you end up going through all that once your father had passed away?
I think I went through like maybe a little bit of denial when I first kind of realized I'd have to prepare. So when he first started getting his transfusions, I was kind of denying it a little bit. I'm like, I'm like, no, he's gonna hold out. My dad's a pretty stubborn man. Like, I think he wants to see my daughter, you know, alive. But that quickly went away. So through the whole entire five stages, I would say no. I think that I attribute that to my dad literally because he left on such good terms, right? And sometimes it's not the how many words or how many moments you got. I only had like 3 moments with him towards the end of his life and a few phone calls. So it wasn't like I was around him constantly, right? It's a different experience for my sister, but that was enough for me. So I got to acceptance really fast. I think also because my faith came into a lot of it, right? Like in the Catholic faith, we all hope that we're living a life that would let us go into heaven. And he kind of said something that just made the entire family laugh. He told my mom, you know, he'll go first, and don't worry, he'll be in front of, you know, heaven's gate, dancing naked, waiting for my mom. Like, how do you not accept death when you have someone that tells you that, right? Like, especially coming from a faith-based person, like he's gonna be waiting in front of heaven for my mom, and no matter what, like, man, that's love, right? And so I got to acceptance pretty fast, but I think that was a lot of the family around me. That was a lot of my mom, my sister helping me through it. And then my dad just had this way. Again, his true self somehow just came out at the end, and that made it so positive as death can be. So we were really fortunate. People were surprised at how I was happy to see people at the funeral, and my mom was the same way. I wasn't bawling and crying, you know, like I had a few moments, but when we got to just kind of the funeral reception, I was genuinely happy to see people be there for us and for my dad. Like there was, yeah, I don't know how to explain it. It's weird, Brian. Like I wasn't sad at that moment, and that's different, right? Like a lot of people are very, very sad, and I had just a different experience.
Were there any challenges that you guys had to deal with? I know a lot of times, like, you know, I work with a lot of not home health. I work with a lot of senior citizens, for example, right, when I do physical therapy. And one of the most important questions we always ask my clients, or my patients rather, is one, did you set up a will? And two, do you have a durable power of attorney? Like, did you guys have any challenges associated with that process of dealing with the aftermath of the passing?
Here's a happy moment in this particular episode, right? Like, my mom and dad, they talked about death early enough that they prepared for it. And then they also had a couple things in life. They did have to declare bankruptcy once. And so in order to move our family forward, my mom, my parents actually ended up asking my sister and I to use our credit, to use our names, to buy cars, to whatever, build our credit up anyway. So this was a way for them to break us out of the generational financial like bracket, right? And so when it got to the end, my dad was like, there's nothing left for us to do on the financial side, right? Death benefits go to my mom for Social Security and some pension stuff. And then really like a couple of bills in his name. But everything else in their life was already transitioned. So if there's the silver lining in this is if you could get to the point where you have transitioned all of your assets and taking care of your liabilities and transfer all your assets to your kids before you pass away. And mind you, my parents did this way before my dad even started the transfusions. They just kind of, did that. Then I think it's a helpful move to build generational wealth for immigrant parents or low-income parents, right? My parents didn't have a lot of assets. It's not like they didn't have property and cars for me and my sister to divide up and things. Like it was just one life insurance policy and that's it, right? Like they didn't own a house. Any of the cars that they had were under my sister and my name. But if your parents are low income or if you have family and like you're going to pass away in the next 10 years or something like that, you have a sense. Transitioning your assets earlier, and the people that are around you, you keep them close. That's a recipe for success. That built my sister and my credit early. That helped us. But at the very end, I asked because I had this question. I go to my mom and my sister. I go, is there anything we need to do? Sign paperwork, whatever? They're like, no, we're done. I'm like, what do you mean we're done? We barely finished the funeral, right? And they're like, yeah, we just sent the death certificate, and they acknowledge receipt, and then it's going to be transferred over, and then we're good, right? Like that was a load off, Brian. And that's like the best practical advice that could come out of this, which is, if you're millions of dollars, if you're worth millions of dollars, it's a whole different ball game, right? We're talking low income, not many assets, but you might have life insurance, you might have something else, one big ticket item. Just take care of that way ahead, like 5-10 years ahead of time. Don't do it the last year. Don't do it when you're emotionally unstable or emotionally, in a bad place, or physically, mentally, emotionally. So it got even easier, and I think that helped me recover faster, right? So like bad news. My dad passes, and then the funeral, and then I find out finances are easy. So then I go, and then I have the birth of my daughter. The irony though is what normally people would take the first 6 months to grieve and things like that, it spread out over 2-3 years for me. I'm still kind of grieving, right? So like there were moments I was busy with work and going on plane trips, and I think about my dad, and I almost like I'm in a hotel room bawling up. I'm in a plane almost about to cry. Like I'm holding back tears, right? So my grieving process got spread 2-3 years. The immediate effect was I was so busy. I had to get going and get back to DC just in case and be with Lena, because she was by herself too, right? So it's a weird thing. And if people can take moments when they're grieving to just let things happen the way they are happening, that's going to give some comfort. It's going to take the stress out. Okay, I got to live on with life. Just go. You'll grieve later is my biggest advice. Like I'm still grieving 3 years later, right? And some people tell me it doesn't go away. So don't try to get it all done in the first 6 months to move on with your life. Like for the people who feel like they can't move on, you can, because you can take a long time to grieve. If there's ever a permission to do that, this would be the right reason to do that. And that was a big thing. I kind of transitioned from your original question, which is transition your assets as much as you can. But that was, I think, something that was incredibly helpful to me.
You know, one of the, I don't want to call it a conundrum, but one of the weirdest things is that we assume that our loved ones are going to be there forever, right? Like I still see myself as that little kid and the memories of like my mom, for example. But I realize, like, you know, I'm in my mid 30s. My mom's close to hitting retirement age. Like we're starting to hit that age where at least, well, you already experienced it, but our friends and families, for example, their parents are getting older, and we have to start realizing, like, you know, our parents aren't going to be here forever. And that's one of the things I realize now is like we have to start learning how to appreciate the time that we have with our loved ones, because at some point there's, you know, we can't get that time back, and they're just going to be a memory. You know what I mean? Like, for example, with the loss of my, you know, my dog, our dog, you assume they're that little puppy forever until they're not, you know? And so I just want to remind everybody that it's important to realize that, you know, life is so fleeting, and that we got to learn to appreciate the time that we have with the people that are closest to us, like you. Like I look at you and see we're not those kids anymore. Like we're adult men, and at some point, hopefully, God forbid, one of us is going to get sick, and we start getting down that rabbit hole of one of us might die. And that's going to, you know, sorry, transition, but you know what I'm trying to say.
It matters so much for the person that's about to lose their life, how they end it for the people around them. That's one thing that my dad taught me. And this is hard because if you're watching this and you lost someone to COVID, it's completely out of their control, right? And their body is not theirs. Their energy is not their own. The person who is dying, like they're not leaving on their terms. But for other cases where you might be able to leave on your own terms, or own it enough and not deny it, like the way my dad did, he literally went around saying goodbye to people for the last time. He goes, "Hey, it's been great knowing you. You know, I really enjoyed our life together. I valued, you know, these moments that we had. And I just wanted to say goodbye before I leave this earth." Like people were in more denial than my dad. They were mad at him for saying that and talking when my dad knew it was a medical fact that what was going to happen. But for him to be able to do that and leave it and then play with my nephew as much as he could, that's a gift, right? So anytime we can enable that for the people that we're about to lose, that is something that maybe we, as the generation that might see our parents, can emotionally prepare ourselves. If the time comes to not wallow in it, but enable that person to leave on their own terms in life, is going to be such a huge gift. And it's a weird way of me describing the death of my father, the passing of my father. But there were a lot of positive things that hit me emotionally from the way of how he handled it, right? And so that's pretty important. You know, you couple that with acceptance coming early enough that I can move on with my life, and then dealing with the grief over a longer period of time. I kind of didn't. I'm going through the 5 stages of was it the 5 stages of grief or loss? Like I'm going through that, but in a different order, primarily because of the way that my dad left the earth and passed away. So that's pretty interesting, Brian. Like as much as I respect science, I respect, you know, psychology, like that stuff didn't apply.
That's, I mean,
it you know,
we all, I mean, there's different ways that we all deal with it. So Patrick, no, we appreciate you sharing your story of, because it's never easy really talking about something that has so much meaning and value to you. Is there any advice or I guess recommendations for people who are dealing with the loss of a loved one? Like what would you recommend to them?
I think about this a lot, and people deal the circumstances around a person, their loved ones passing is so different for everyone. I'm gonna suggest a couple of things that one or two worked for me, and one of them was just nice to know it was there, right? The couple of things that worked for me was, and it still is, focusing on how they made you a better person and remembering them in those times. Because when you lose someone, you have these thoughts of like, oh, I wish I do this still. I wish my dad was here to see this. I bought this house, Brian, like this. I really wanted to show it off to him, and he never even knew that I bought a house, right? Like he knows from heaven, hopefully, but he doesn't know when he was here. And this was like a big goal in our life, in my life, that I wanted to show him. I can do it, Dad, right? Like, be proud of me. Again, that Asian thing, and that's, I think, for everyone. But you're gonna go through moments where you miss the person. That's fine. Take a moment, breathe. That's what I have to do. I have to just stop. But when you focus on the things of, oh, I'm like this because of that person, something good, right? Something that gets you excited, something that's positive. Remember them and thank them for it, right? Like, I still thank my dad for a lot of things. I thank him for teaching me how to hammer, teaching me how to, decently work my way around a car, barely, these days. I thank him for it. So be thankful of what the person has taught you that makes you who you are. And then you'll start to understand your values, your true self a little bit more. The one thing that helped it helped me because I knew it was there. Someone at my church in DC, after they heard that, my dad passed, invited me to a grieving support group. I didn't go, again, because at the time I was, newborn, babies there, like, moving and whatever, like work was still pretty crazy. But just knowing that, getting the invitation, right? That felt like a sense of community, and I didn't even go, right? Like it was an email of all things, right? We talk about how digital things will, an email from the community inviting me helped me so much. Like at that moment, it was just, I think it was a couple months after, or a month or two after, and that's all I needed, that reinforcement. So if you get those, don't dismiss them. Just be thankful of them. And I think that'll help. I'm hoping it'll help, right? Like individually, people will deal with it in their own ways, but I've tried to just continue to remember and thank him for the things that he taught me well, the lessons in life, my dadisms, all the sayings that he's had. It's amazing how much I quote him now that he's gone. Like I go, oh well, my dad, I even did this in our videos. Like a lot of these life lessons are coming from him, and so it's just a little bit of my homage to him, like a thankfulness.
So we Patrick, we appreciate you for sharing the story. And the one thing that you've always been that strong guy. I've never actually seen you cry. So, you continue to hold it up really strong. So just want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. And I know that losing a loved one is particularly hard, but understand that, that's essentially, it's part of life. Like we all eventually do pass our time, and just knowing that as long as we cherish those memories that we had with our loved ones, those are always going to be with us forever. So we just want to thank you for listening to the Introspection Hour with Brian and Patrick, and we will see you guys next time.
See you.